Chris.
Hey Tom, you're right.
Yeah, very good. So yeah, I mean, as we were saying, well, the reality was that they actually are trying to claim that we have to take everything down. It's not just um, cordyceps and charities, based on the fact that because we are doing an ethanol extraction, that is changing the sort of chemical composition away from a food supplement. So we're going to push back on that because there's obviously lots of evidence of herbal supplements being alcohol extraction. But yeah, I mean, I think it's ironic because we were actually approached by like a Today program who are doing a thing on the sort of wellness stroke supplement industry. And they had a meeting with the in London with the FSA, I think, and they said that there was just a huge amount of confusion in terms of what the actual reality is from a legal perspective.
Yeah.
And then 3 days later, we get this sort of cease and desist notice from this new, well, relatively new. It's under a year old. This thing called the National Food Crime Unit.
Oh
Uh,
fuck.
Sounds very.
I know. I was going to say that makes it sound.
My kids were jokingly hoping that I was going to get locked up so they wouldn't have to be too overly exposed to dad anymore.
Yeah,
So,
not so lucky.
yeah, not so lucky. So what's happened is because because obviously local councils are broke like the rest of us, they've created this sort of centralised team to sort of orchestrate the smaller number of peoples in the local council, and we just happen to be in the firing line at the moment. So yeah, so we've got some delightfully expensive lawyers who a couple of other guys have used previously to push back on some of this. And what was interesting is we thought that by offering like a potentially pet product, not for human consumption, you could mitigate some of the issues. And they have pushed back on that as well, saying that we need a pet feed license. So so that's
Oh man,
another
I
thing
did. I
to.
did have. I had a brief look on Amazon after just to see what products are like. How these products are marketed on Amazon. Like almost all of them are marketed as pet food products now,
Yeah, I mean,
which is a
what's frustrating is that there are so many companies that are sort of flying not necessarily under the radar, but are not going to get approached. I don't think,
yeah,
and especially if you're you know based outside of the UK, you've got very little jurisdiction over you. So it's kind of ironic, really, that those of us that are growing and doing everything in the UK are far more precariously poised because they can, you know,
yeah,
choose to. Because we're like at the final stage before they issue a stop notice, basically, which means that we're supposed to stop, and if we carry on trading, then we're potentially liable for a very large fine as a percentage of turnover, not even profit, up to the point that it goes to court. And
yeah,
if you're found in breach of whatever it may be, then they would levy a percentage of your turnover over that period of
yeah.
time you've been in violation of the stop order.
That would, I guess, that would fuck with your insurance and all that sort of stuff as well. So,
The idea that they could take any percentage of turnover, given the fact that there's almost zero profit, it means that any percentage of turnover
yeah,
would require a well, it would be the end.
yeah,
So especially if it was like above, probably might be able to handle like a 5% one, but if it got up to 10%, we would. Well, actually, to be honest, even if it got up to 5%, we'd probably have to. It's not entirely unexpected to a certain degree because the novel food list has been there. Although there's huge quantities of products out there that do have these products in them. At some point it was likely to happen.
yeah,
And I think it's also complicated by the fact that from a regulatory perspective, mushrooms are not viewed as having any approved medical claims, which also makes it very difficult to say anything about them, which is the motivation, well, one of the motivations for trying to raise some money and get the process started for actually having these things
yeah,
reappraised and possibly, you know, hopefully, we might find one benefit of Brexit, which is that, maybe they can actually, I mean, I doubt it very much given the state of our courts, but they might be able to do it quickly. That's the, if we can put it together relatively quickly, then because I've been looking through a lot of the EU sort of legislation on this, and it does appear that there have been in the last couple of years quite a few sort of applications by mushroom companies for like a sort of guidance judgment on some of these mushrooms, and certainly there's been a little bit of on chaga, for example. If you're not extracting it, that it does fall under a novel food sort of regulation. Fortunately, we are extracting it, so it doesn't fall under that for us. And I think the reality with all this stuff, it's just they set a sort of a date at 1997 for the point at which, if there was no evidence of anything being imported into the UK or into the EU, then it would fall under like a novel food type application. But what's interesting is on this novel food thing, they do actually mention specific types of mushroom. Obviously, we know that there are thousands of mushrooms that have very similar compound profiles. So, for example, we're currently growing, I think, 11 different species of Ganoderma, and a lot of those aren't even mentioned on any of the legislation. So what happens when we release a product that we know what the peaks are going to be, thanks to like Piam doing all his HPLC analysis, but they're not, they're not on the novel foods list, but they're also not on the approved food list, because the issue with the sort of whole food supplement side is that obviously a lot of mushrooms have been consumed as food over time, but obviously the majority of mushrooms that we're probably the majority now of the mushrooms that we grow are not actually edible mushrooms. So there isn't that history of culinary use from a sort of cultural perspective, which which makes up part of the sort of justification for accepting that there's no risk to human health from these things if there's evidence that they've been consumed in a culture for a long period of time. And with Cordyceps militaris, because it was only really isolated, early 90s, and it went through the whole sort of human consumption sort of testing side in China in a very short space of time. And now it actually makes up a bigger proportion of the Cordyceps market than Cordyceps sinensis globally. But it's because of that fact that it's a relatively new isolate, and one that they've been able to, crack the code on how to grow it commercially 30 years ago. So, that's the sort of reason why militaris has fallen foul of it. Turkey tail, the reason that's fallen foul is because of the fact that, although it's probably undeniable that in a lot of sort of pre-Christian cultures, people would have been using these mushrooms, and certainly in Eastern Europe to a degree, I think turkey tail's got some historical cultural use. Obviously in Asia, it's got much, much, much longer history. But because it isn't a foodstuff and people haven't been eating it, then that's been the sort of prohibitive realities from a regulatory perspective, and having confidence that it's not going to detrimentally affect humans. Because a lot of this regulation is actually set up with good intentions, because you don't want just some random mushroom being, sold just because someone claims it does X, Y, and Z. The problem being is that the two that, they're choosing to focus on at this stage, there is just a huge amount of evidence that there is nothing to be concerned about. And there's also a huge amount of evidence of actual consumption by humans over very long periods of time, and also currently in every other country, pretty much apart from the EU and the UK. So, there are valid cases to be made that you need to have some regulation for like new mushrooms being offered to the public. We've been offered various mushrooms from guys in Peru that have found these new. You probably have as well. Have you this new cordyceps, and we're like, that's great, but there's no way we can take that to market. We've no idea. Whether or not it has any effect on humans. We've no idea what's in it. And all these sort of guys that are going off doing bioprospecting in jungles all over the world. The idea that you can just find a mushroom and then just claim that it's good for X, Y, and Z. I mean, it's just not the way.
Yeah.
The way
And also, I think there's been like, as like the functional mushroom industry has been kind of like self-regulating for, for quite some time now. As an industry, everyone's kind of quite well ahead where we are from a regulation sort of perspective. And the fact that like so much science is being done, regardless of government input is a kind of a testament, but also it must be so much easier and safer for them to just say, well, look, no, until we know.
Yeah, and
And
I think
it's
also there's, so much going on in the world at the moment. I
yeah,
think it's so far down their list of priorities. And I mean, I think I would perhaps push back slightly that the mushroom industry is particularly good at sort of self-regulating. I think there are definitely some.
cowboys.
Yeah, I mean, I think in an ideal world, you'd have some level of sort of agreement at a sort of from a sort of sector perspective, but I don't think you're going to get that because
Yeah,
the variety of quantities of compounds in the products that are available on the market is extreme, and so I don't think you're ever going to get. Quite a few people's business models are based on the ability to scale, which means make a lot more product out of 1 gram of mushroom.
yeah,
And so, you're never gonna. People always pretend that they want, regulation, but everyone's who's trying to grow like, multi-million pound companies don't really want there to be any
yeah,
agreement on
yeah,
much. Well, unless everyone just wants to, set up a mushroom farm in China and,
yeah.
try.
Well, and this is also, this is kind of like a separate thing that that has been the case from the beginning, is that like the second there was any utility at all seen with functional mushrooms, it's like you get people who are just good marketers just saying, right, while we legally can't say this thing, we could just pay some influencer to say that they're having these, that they're having these personal effects with, that they feel like their ADHD's been cured and
Yeah,
A, B, and C, and it. I guess my early concern was that like that sort of marketing would eventually catch up, and it would actually someone in the regulatory sort of space would go, why the fuck are these guys saying it cures all these things,
yeah, and
who says who,
that's slightly different. So that, and there have been a few instances of sort of well-financed brands getting called out for that sort of thing by the Advertising Standards Authority. But a lot of these companies, not all, but the majority, they're just using certificate of analysis from
years ago.
China, and we're lucky in the sense that we're doing huge amounts of testing every week, and I'd say in our experience, about 1 in 5 of the COAs you get from China is correct. And I think, but no one needs to test them. So, I think what would be great if there was a requirement to test, but, we can go down a rabbit hole here on how it's quite easy to test certain products for like total quantities of certain compounds, but that doesn't mean those compounds are actually available for the body. So there's lots of ways of making it look from a consumer's perspective that they're buying like lots in their product, whereas in reality there might be lots in there, but they're not going to get anything out. Or other people who are claiming, sort of unique ways of extracting from mushrooms and therefore yielding huge amounts. Well, I mean, the truth is, even with the most like efficacious extraction methodology, you're still only going to be pulling out 20% of what's in there. So if you were to just sell a powder which hadn't been extracted, there'd be 5 times the amount of compounds. And so, it's very difficult to create like a sort of standard where people are going to sign up to it, because if you want to create a nice looking product, just test it before you've done anything to it. Just dry it, test it, and go, there's loads in there.
Yeah,
Much better than the other ones. There is loads more in there, but
yeah. And also, it's like I've noticed that that there's also obviously batch testing that's done. Certificates are often produced, and it's like you look at the dates on these, and they like the last batch test was done years ago, and
yeah, I
it's
mean
just become
that's
like a point of advertising where it's
yeah,
like,
that really
we
has.
have Eurofins testing, and
Yeah,
you're like,
I mean,
fuck
I
me.
think that's one side of it. I think that on the positive, Piam, our analytical chemist, says, Tom, the more I test other companies' products, the more confidence I have in yours. And I'm like, that's
That's what you want to hear.
that's, that's definitely not where you started from. So it's it is that kind of funny reality of he has done so much testing now, maybe 70 different compounds a week he's getting results back on now. To be fair, there are a couple of like very well-known companies that started using Piam, which is great because and they're buying in stuff from China, but the reality is very different to what it says on paper. So they've got these huge batches they're putting through, and you don't really know when they're produced anyway. So it's a long story. From our perspective, I think that trying to actually play the game and actually make an application for these things to be reconsidered is the
Yeah.
only way we're going to like actually be able to legally get these products back into people's hands. And it's really frustrating because you look at the US market, all these things are fine. You look at the Asian market, all these things are fine. And it's only really, well, it is only the EU and the UK where these things are viewed as potentially problematic. So hopefully we can address that, and it's going to be quite interesting. I've got a chat with one of the guys one of the scientists who used to sit on the novel foods board, and so I think it'll be interesting to just get this process started
Yeah.
and see where it leads. But I don't think it's not going to be a quick fix. So what is interesting is a lot of the like cell line work we do with our PhD, looking at our different tinctures. The one that we cannot put too much of a concentrated solution on it is turkey tail. It is literally non-toxic to cell lines, whereas all the rest of them, we have to dilute it to find a dilution where we can see biological activity with the different cell lines that doesn't actually just kill them. And so it's kind of interesting that that one literally is the least toxic of any of the mushrooms we grow. Plus it has no like contraindications for sort of the whole endocrine system. So I mean they couldn't really have chosen one which has less actual scientific justification.
Yeah.
But I think mainly because it's not edible. So there isn't a history of people eating it. Obviously, up until relatively recently, everyone thought that, there wasn't a single polypore that was in any way toxic. I mean, I think there's one now that is slightly toxic, but
Yeah.
As a sort of genus, it's
Pretty
about
safe.
about as safe as it comes from a mushroom.
So are there any other industries really that have gone through? I mean, I'm thinking like CBD
Yeah,
maybe, like
CBD, yeah,
yeah,
100%.
it's like a good example of
Yeah. So actually, the lawyer we're using, he's been in this sort of space for about 10 years, in the novel food space. And they tried to argue a similar thing with supercritical CO2 extraction with CBD, that by putting it through that process, you were changing the inherent nature of, the cannabis plant, which obviously you're not. And they failed to get that through. I think they failed to get it through on some sort of technicality rather than necessarily on just on the weight of evidence. I think the big difference is, though, that in the CBD space, lots of companies are actually making money, whereas in the mushroom space, barring one or two, not really any of us are making any money. And
yeah.
so the ability to actually, and a lot of the CBD companies raise quite a lot of investment, whereas in the mushroom space, sort of a couple have so there just isn't the weight of finance in the mushroom space as there is in CBD, as there was or is in the CBD space, and so the ability to like marshal funds to actually put these applications in isn't really there.
Yeah.
Which is why we started that whole GoFundMe site, because the reality is that there just isn't the finance available in companies to be able to
Yeah.
finance this.
Challenges, yeah. So the process at the moment then is so you said you've got this notice. From a regulation perspective, are all companies like, do they have to get a notice before they have to stop selling this, or is it
I mean,
like is it
personally,
like just
I would carry on. I mean, actually, I don't know really well. I should say this not, but
this is not
I,
legal advice, by the way.
it's not legal
Do your
advice.
own research.
I think the reality from enforcement perspective is that it gets enforced through the FSA, sort of trading standards FSA at a local level,
Mm,
um, and so dependent upon where your business is registered, that's probably it'll be local to that. I think from a sort of top line legal perspective, I think that they are categorized. Well, they are categorized as novel foods, and therefore legally, it's a difficult one to justify. Yeah, because they haven't been approved for human consumption. The irony of it is something like Cordyceps sinensis, which is approved for human consumption. The reason for that, and that's a mycelium-based product, which obviously we all used to think was CS4, but it's actually which is CS4, but it's actually two other types of fungi, which are actually the ones that seem to be making the bioactive compounds that are relevant. But that one was imported by an Irishman in 1996, and that's the reason why it's viewed as legally kosher.
Yeah.
And what's frustrating from a sort of bioactive perspective, from a sort of human health perspective as well, is that there are less compounds in Cordyceps sinensis, or CS4, than there are in Cordyceps militaris, in particular adenosine and cordycepin. And so it is actually a slightly inferior product. Obviously, you can extract, you can make a more concentrated product to try and get it up to the levels that we had in our Cordyceps militaris. So, yeah, and it's a mycelial product, where normally they hate mycelium-based products from a regulatory perspective.
I did see that was actually on one of the ban lists, was like the actual mycelium. Pretty sure it was like Hericium mycelium was actually
all sorts of mycelium, just because it doesn't have that history of culinary use. And so they like err on the side of caution when it comes to it. And we're actually testing now, because we've bought some aranacines and some hericinones as standards at the lab. So we're now testing a load of different lion's mane, and we're also testing colloides, all sorts of, hopefully before Christmas we'll have about 40 or 50 different results back from different sort of things in the Hericium family. And it'll be really interesting to see, because obviously everyone's said all sorts of things over the years about what's in this, what's in that. And so it's actually good to find out whether or not there is anything in these things. And because I know that when the Fungarium at Kew did the whole sort of DNA profiling, they found that the particular chunk of DNA that seems to code for hericinones was also in colloides. It wasn't in serratum or flagellum. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not what is actually in the colloides. So yeah, finally we're going to get some actual answers over all this stuff.
That's exciting.
Yeah, no, it is exciting. It's only taken a year to get here. And, God knows how many tens of thousands of pounds, but we'll get there finally. There are, quite a few mushrooms in Asia that have been used medicinally that we're not using currently. But what's interesting with these is they're not on the novel food list, but they're also not on the approved list. So I'm not quite sure how this is going to sit when we, try and launch some of these over here. And equally with our this Ganoderma product we're doing with 11 different Ganodermas, there is historical usage of all these different Ganodermas in different parts of the world, but most of these don't show up on any of these sort of approved lists. And so we're going to be entering into a very grey area when it comes to what we're doing.
Can you just label things not for human consumption, or is this I
think this is what we're going to sort of try and establish with the lawyer when we go to the FSA, or to whatever it is, the National Food Crime Union, trying to establish what their justification is for saying these things, and try and understand, because obviously we want to be clear about what we're growing or what we're doing. You could make the argument that just claim you're doing something completely different, but I mean it's it doesn't get anywhere fundamentally, because
no, exactly. And also when you wouldn't be able to make any any advice on dosage or anything like that then, so you're kind of you're creating this situation where your customers are
creating this
dark.
false reality, which is just as we all know, tiring. I mean, it's going to be an interesting period to just try and establish what basis all of this stuff is on, because I think we're going to find that actually it's not really based on any sort of firm legal position, or a slightly hopefully a slightly uninformed take on the sort of current legal advice. Because obviously at the moment we're potentially staring down the barrel of a gun if they're saying we can't have an ethanol extract, because for some of the mushroom, the ethanol extract is brutally important. So interestingly, what we found actually recently with the lion's mane, doing a water extract, you get absolutely zero hericinones out, zero. It's actually very bad for hericinones being exposed to water and doing these long, cooks at low temperature, and even the ones at high temperature. And so we're having to change the sort of extraction methodology we're using on the ethanol side in order to make sure that we're pulling out these compounds. And so with Piam, his stuff, he's able to use methanol, hexane, and all sorts of interesting industrial
extraction techniques.
They have a lot more polarity to pull stuff out. So, how we're then integrating that knowledge into our extraction processes to try and pull out as many of these things as possible. Because how the vast majority, almost I'd say everyone in the UK is extracting for lion's mane, they're going to be getting zero harissa-bones at the moment, like absolutely zero. So it's the trouble with science, doesn't make your job any easier.
I've always kind of felt for you guys a bit, right? Because, a very small amount of companies that actually bother to do things in a way that's like responsible and actually, that does the real work. And then you could quite easily have just said, let's just do this as a marketing exercise, and it would have probably been so much better for you.
I think what would have been easiest, like the best thing that we could have done would have been to when we were using a lab in the US, and the results we were getting back were so positive. We thought we had the most unbelievable product ever known to man, and it turned out that they were just not very good chemists, and they were a number. But this is the other trouble. There are people. I'm not going to say who it is, but there are people that are using this lab and
Yeah.
then releasing these results. And like our results were like 20 times better than that. But we know that that lab gives you results that are 10 times higher
Yeah.
that are actually real. And I think this is the other thing. There are levels to like competence when it comes to analytical chemists. Just because you've come out of uni and you've just done a PhD, as opposed to someone like Payam who's been doing it for 30 years and he is an absolute pedant. And so I think this is the other thing. You can use labs and they can develop these methodologies, which are bollocks. And
Yeah.
you learn that with these results. And obviously you can get these results that make yours look so much better than everyone else's. But we're quite cynical here. And we're
Yeah.
like, it's got to have made a mistake. And he was like, no, that's true. We sent more through and kept on coming back. And, this is the whole trouble with it. You can, you can create a very false narrative very easily. And, that's a good way of selling product, basically.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So, you can mask it on. There have been some, particularly, successful, well, there have been a couple of successful companies that have managed to sort of do that, dress everything up as being very science-led, and it all looks very true and proper until you actually test their products. And then it's like, wow, that's extraordinary. Those don't have, they have hardly anything in them.
I've always felt like it puts the entire progress of the industry under threat when if we're realistic about the results and if we're realistic about the benefits, then like there's more longevity to this industry. It's like we actually kind of start to build something that has a basis in truth.
And it's not that they're deliberately doing a bad job in a lot of cases. They think they're doing a good job and they think that they're making a product which has like benefits from a human health perspective. And 30% of the time, someone that takes that product is going to get, a noticeable benefit. But for the people that have like acute conditions, it's potentially quite dangerous because people are going to be taking these products thinking, oh, I've read X, Y, and Z, I've read that scientific study. If I take this, it's going to regulate that function. And the thing is, with almost every like human clinical trial, and there haven't been that many done, but they're generally done alongside chemo or radiotherapy. And dose is so important. You need to take a high dose, and this is why, like, it's potentially worrying that there is no sort of accepted. But this is the trouble because we're then going into like the pharmaceutical world where you need to know the molecular weight, like how much of X compound is in that from a molecular weight perspective to be able to advise on a dose. And so in this sort of funny situation where we're not selling a pharmaceutical product, but we're using the same science and the same machines and the same processes that pharmaceutical companies use to count and weigh compounds. And so, it is a funny one because we are sort of slightly like a step further away from like a sort of basic food supplement. Like, for example, on one of our recent products, we put the quantity of ergothioneine in, which is actually like the fourth lowest of any of our products, but we put ergothioneine on there just because we're testing for it. We can get it on there. If we were to, we can have like a 10-time higher ergothioneine reading on our chlorotis product. But we're now opening ourselves up to like issues from a regulatory perspective, putting an actual quantity of one particular compound lawyers have now told us that that's putting us like into this new space, and this is the trouble. It is an absolute minefield for people that are just trying to create a really good product, that are skeptical and interested and want to find out what's in it, want to find out if we can grow mushrooms that have higher
Yeah.
quantities of these things. And so, it's kind of difficult finding that middle course because, because the more you quantify and qualify your product, further towards the sort of pharmaceutical regulation or regulatory environment you're going in. And that causes a whole amount of issues when it
Yeah.
comes to, how you're set up and like the processes you're doing. And fundamentally, the amount of money you need to be
Yeah,
able to.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it just puts you in a completely, like you said, it puts you in a completely different industry, doesn't it?
Yeah, where there
And the
is like,
levels of, of money from a legal standpoint and the amount of
and
hurdles.
the barriers to entry in terms of
Yeah,
the processes and how you get like you need serious cash.
yeah.
Uh, and I can assure you that's not something we have. And also, we haven't sold any equity, so like maybe if we want to sell our souls, maybe we
Yeah, yeah.
do
GlaxoSmithKline,
that
I'd
5 years
love a bit of the
time around.
Bristol Fungarium
Like,
action.
yeah, I could go and buy myself a hill and build myself a cave. I think at the moment it was obviously really stressful when it happened because it looked like they were just trying to shut us down immediately.
Yeah,
But with weeks past, we've had unbelievable support from people, like overwhelming, like literally overwhelming, because we actually haven't got enough human resource to fulfill orders or even customer service getting back to people because it's like, yeah, honestly,
that's good.
yeah, I mean, it's lovely. It's
I think
great.
they call it success problems in this industry,
Is that
or
what they
any
call it?
industry.
I mean, it's yeah. I mean, there's a lot of communication going on, which is great. And I think, ultimately, if we can start the process to getting these things recategorized, then that will be a fantastic thing to come out of this.
Yeah,
Um, because there is zero real like scientific reason why these should be placed outside of things like, I don't know, Maitake lines, Shiitake, all these sorts of things.
yeah,
So, but it's just a question of, having the time and money. We know the right people to make the application. When it comes to sort of intellectual capital, we're very lucky that we've got lots of friends who, are very competent and qualified, far more so than we are, who are really keen to get involved and do this. And so, yeah, unfortunately, we need to give them the tools to do that, which is pay them basically.
yeah. So
That's
we talked briefly before about potentially setting up some sort of like crowdfunding for people to be able to put into.
yeah. So
Is that something that's already been
we
done?
have
Or you...
we set up a little GoFundMe in about 10 minutes. We're going to put 5 grand in to get it started. Although I tried to put 5 grand in, but apparently you can't fund your own GoFundMe, so they put it back. So I can assure you, I did try,
Yeah, okay.
and I have to come up with.
Just assume it's there.
Yeah, it was there. If you saw it in the first 3 minutes, it was there. I have to get one of my transfer some money to one of my sons or daughters and get them
Yeah,
to put it in under a different surname or something. But yeah, and I think realistically, people always quote huge numbers for these sorts of things, and we've spoken to quite a few people over the last year and a half about it. We've had 2 people tell us it's 100 grand. We've had a couple of people think you could probably get it done for like 40 or 50. So we're trying to get 50 basically. But I think what normally happens with these things is we'll try and get some money. We'll get, someone started on it. And I'll try and do it as cheaply as possible. So
yeah,
that's I think the thing is with a lot of these other companies that are more finance, like the CBD guys and stuff like that, I think because they have, more resource to a certain degree, if you're going to people and saying, I need this done, and they know that you've got money, they'll
yeah.
say,
They try
oh,
and
it's
rinse
going
you.
to cost you X.
Yeah,
But quite often, I think if you can go in and, say, I've got this amount of money and educate yourself a bit on what's involved so that you can actually put like a time and a sort of value proposition in your head together so that you actually know what's involved on a sort of top line perspective. I
yeah,
think hopefully we can get it done for a lot less
yeah.
because imagine it'd be amazing if like
I
the
mean, it would
UK.
benefit absolutely, the amount of like, support that would give to all the small businesses that are doing this and the anxiety that, that it would remove would be great.
Yeah, it'd be amazing because I mean we know so many small guys that are, like us trying to grow mushrooms and extract them and sell them to people. If you take out turkey tail and cordyceps, that really does have a detrimental effect on quite a few guys and girls that are doing this. And because we're all sort of on a knife edge between, profitability and loss, you take out those two, certainly for us, it puts us into loss territory
Yeah.
like every month. And I imagine it's the same for most other people. And so, it is sort of like an existential reality if you take out those two from a lot of the small mushroom growers. And I know
Yeah.
it's not a huge amount of people, but there's a fair few hundred people
Well,
that
it's
are in.
everyone. I think the thing to remember is just everyone we know, isn't it? You
Yeah,
know,
yeah, that's it. Yeah,
it may
fundamentally.
not, in terms of like comparing it to the rest of Britain, it's not a big amount of people, but
Yeah,
it's every
but it
person
is
that we
like,
know. So
there's a lot of bad people.
no, exactly that, and
not,
that's,
not,
you
none of
know,
them are making any money really. So yeah, I mean we're all hopeful individuals,
yeah,
but we need to like
get this done.
we need to get this stuff like looked at, and any reasonably scientifically literate person that's going to make a decision on it.
Yeah.
Uh, I can't. Famous last words. I can't see it failing, but I'm a pretty ignorant guy who always thinks
I mean,
everything's.
it's a good way, it's a good thing to look at it, hopefully, but it's yeah, I mean,
I
the
do
the
look at
biggest the
most
biggest
things in
risk,
life, hopefully, apart from, if I take too much of a, sort of whatever, step back and look at things, systemically and ecologically, and it's quite difficult to be positive there. But in my
no,
day to day, I
yeah,
try and believe that we are capable of affecting what goes on around us, and in this case, hopefully, legislation for mushrooms that really shouldn't be categorized the way they are.
yeah,
But yeah, so let's hope. Hope, who knows? In a year's time, maybe we'll all be
be able to
proudly showing
relax.
off our turkey tail logs. Go look
Yeah,
at
that'd be nice.
this! This is completely legal.
That's it. You won't have to buy your turkey tail, your cordyceps from a dealer.
Yeah. Our entire cordyceps room that we've spent a fortune making, which is going to have absolutely zero. Yeah, I mean, it's just this
Yeah,
is
that's heartbreaking.
it's just and Joey, who spent years of his life doing this, and Ben at Fungi Folks, is it's just like
Yeah.
it's just
Yeah, I mean that's one of the biggest, worries. I know that a lot of people are very heavy into cordyceps as well. Like,
yeah.
and
I
I
think
think because it's so technical, it's like,
it's so technical. It's like the steps sort of beyond just growing a lot of these wood decomposing mushrooms. And
yeah,
so, what's and I think the other thing is with the Cordyceps militaris, it's the one that people actually can notice in real time when you take it. So I think that's
yeah,
the other thing. And also because it's got so much more of the compounds we're interested in than the one that is legally kosher.
yeah.
Which is, it's kind of,
It's the only one. To be honest, it's actually the only one that I consistently take.
yeah, I mean, it's the one at the farm that
Yeah,
is probably the most commonly consumed daily. And so, yeah, it's kind of frustrating. And that, I mean, it's all frustrating, but it's quite, you know, it's frustrating because the guys that are growing it, at scale and effectively and doing some breeding work, it's actually quite an interesting thing to do.
yeah, and it's just nice to be able to
It's like we're
do
all
like to
trying to do
work.
something meaningful and interesting with our lives, and
Yeah, yeah,
you're taking out one of the big like mushrooms that can like generate interest, meaning, and revenue,
yeah,
and also it's the one that it grows in the UK.
yeah,
It's another example of being able to use fungi from these lands for people of these lands, and so
yeah.
it's just
One more quick question.
yeah.
Just is this something that's worth, writing to MPs about and things like that? Do you think,
I
from a
have
local
actually,
standpoint?
I think potentially, yeah. I think once we've had a bit of time to take a step back from the last week, and formulate like a like coherent strategy. So we are actually going to be on the Today program on ITV, which is being recorded in January, and we're going down to Pyme's lab and doing it down there, and that's going to come out at the end of January, and that's all about this sort of regulatory stuff,
Yeah, cool.
and how some of us are actually trying to trying to count what's in our products, and we're the ones getting absolutely bent over, which is just joyous. So yeah, I mean, I think hopefully if we can like keep some sort of momentum going and start reaching out to MPs as well,
Yeah.
At the moment, it's like, we're just trying to get the ball moving. And I'm actually, I'm talking to lots of people that have sort of done this thing before. And so I'll have a much better idea of the strategy to go forwards, because obviously the quicker we can try and expedite this whole thing, and if we can get like political pressure on
Yeah.
and maybe leverage it from it's a wonderful opportunity for England to strike
Yeah,
out.
to band together, yeah, and do something
Yeah,
positive.
UK can finally, set the whatever bollocks they're going to say about it, but we just frame it in the way that it's a unique opportunity for England or whatever.
Yeah.
Sure, there's an angle that we can
Yeah, well, just tell them it's more tax
manipulate.
revenue, isn't it, for the.
Yeah, that's the angle we've got to go on. Yeah, or a a potential loss of revenue. It's the other
Yeah,
one.
exactly. So,
Yeah. Anyway, I hope
all
to
right,
see
mate.
your face sooner rather than later, mate.
Yeah, take it easy. Lovely to speak to you, Tom.
Yeah,
Take care, mate.
and you, mate.
Bye.
Bye.